There is a chalk cross painted on your front door. You painted it yourself, this morning, with your own hand shaking. Not because you were sick, because someone inside your house is. And now the law says you cannot leave. Not to fetch water, not to bury the dead, not even to run. Welcome to London, 1665. You already know the basics, probably. Plague, rats, misery, the usual. But the actual mechanics of surviving it, or not surviving it, are stranger and colder than most people realize. So let's walk through what your life would actually look like, week by week, if you were an ordinary Londoner watching the worst year of the century unfold around you. First, the numbers, because they set the tone for everything else. Every week, the parish clerks publish something called the Bills of Mortality, a printed list of deaths by cause, sold on street corners like a grim newspaper. Samuel Pepys, the naval administrator whose diary is basically the GoPro footage of this entire event, wrote about buying his copy and doing the math in his head, watching the plague column climb from dozens to hundreds to, eventually, over 7,000 deaths in a single week in September of 1665. 7,000 in 1 week. In a city of roughly 400,000 people. Do you understand how fast that is? That's not a slow, creeping dread. That's a city falling through the floor. And here's the first thing that would shock you if you were actually there. The plague didn't kill quietly. It killed with a soundtrack. Bells. Church bells, tolling for every funeral, all day, every day, until Pepys himself admitted he'd stopped noticing them, which is somehow more disturbing than if he'd said they haunted him. When horror becomes background noise, that's when you know you're inside history, not reading about it. Now, who comes to your door when someone gets sick? Not a doctor, a searcher. These were usually older women, often poor, paid a small fee by the parish to visit houses, look at the body or the symptoms, and officially declare cause of death for the Bills of Mortality. They had no medical training. None. They were guessing, based on black swellings called buboes, in the groin, the armpit, the neck, swellings that could balloon to the size of an egg within a day. Once a searcher declared plague in your house, the machinery of the law switched on. And that machinery was not there to help you. Because the moment plague was confirmed, your house was shut up, sealed. A watchman posted outside, the cross painted on the door, the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," stenciled beneath it. Everyone inside, sick, healthy, doesn't matter, stayed inside for 40 days. 40 days locked in with the disease that just killed your neighbor. Think about that policy for a second. It wasn't designed around evidence. It was designed around visibility, making the danger legible to the street, containing it where officials could see it, even if containment meant trapping the healthy in a box with the dying. So what did you actually do all day, shut in a house with a corpse and a curfew? You waited. You watched the swellings on your own skin. You listened to the cart outside, the dead cart, driven at night, the driver calling out, "Bring out your dead," through streets lit only by the occasional lantern, because London had ordered bonfires kept burning to purify the air, which did nothing except make an already apocalyptic city smell like smoke and rot at the same time. Let's actually stand in that street for a moment, because statistics don't do it justice. It's past midnight. You're a driver, and this is your job now, has been for 6 weeks. The cartwheels are grinding over cobblestones slick with September rain. Windows are shuttered. Every house you pass has either a cross on the door or the eerie, complete silence of a family that already fled. You call out the same phrase you've called out 200 times tonight. A door creaks open down the block. A shape, wrapped in linen, is passed out into your arms. Light, always lighter than you expect a person to be. You lay it in the cart, next to the others, and you keep walking, because there are more houses, and dawn is still hours away, and the pit at the edge of the parish churchyard is already half full and getting deeper by the day. Here's a shock beat worth sitting with. Those plague pits weren't myth or exaggeration. In 2011, researchers led by Hendrik Poinar at McMaster University extracted and reconstructed genetic material from 13th and 14th century plague pit remains found under East Smithfield in London, confirming the presence of Yersinia pestis, the actual bacterium, still recoverable from bones centuries later. That's not folklore. That's a molecule, sitting dormant in a tooth root for hundreds of years, waiting for a lab to ask it a question. And here's where the popular story starts to crack. You were taught it was rats. Filthy rats, fleas, simple as that. But more recent modeling, including work published by researchers analyzing outbreak patterns across European cities, suggests the classic rat-flea explanation doesn't actually fit the speed at which plague tore through some communities. Human fleas and body lice, spreading directly person to person in crowded, unwashed households, may have driven transmission just as much, maybe more, than any rodent. Which means the vermin weren't the whole villain. You were, unknowingly, part of the delivery system. Your clothes were, your bedding was. That's a far less comfortable story than blaming the rats, isn't it? If you had money, incidentally, you didn't stay for any of this. King Charles II and his entire court packed up and relocated to Oxford within weeks of the death toll rising, and anyone with the means followed. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it reveals the actual shape of the crisis. The plague wasn't democratic, it was a filter. Poverty decided who was locked in a sealed house with a corpse, and wealth decided who got to simply leave the city entirely and wait it out in the countryside, untouched. But not everyone who could have run did. Here's the twist that flips this entire story on its head. 90 miles north, in a small Derbyshire village called Eyam, plague arrived hidden in a bundle of cloth from London in 1665. The village rector, William Mompesson, made an extraordinary decision alongside the local Puritan minister. They convinced the entire village to voluntarily quarantine itself. No one in, no one out. For over a year. They set up boundary stones on the edge of the village where outsiders left food and supplies in exchange for coins left soaking in vinegar or spring water, believed to disinfect the money. Roughly 260 villagers died, including Mompesson's own wife, Catherine. But by sealing themselves off, they very likely stopped the plague from spreading further into the north of England. They chose the very containment that London forced on people at gunpoint, except they chose it themselves, for each other, knowing exactly what it would cost. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The exact same policy, sealed houses, imposed isolation, was horrifying and often lethal when the state did it to the poor of London by force. And it was quietly heroic when a village chose it for itself, together, with consent. The mechanism was identical. The meaning was completely different. Isolation isn't inherently cruel or inherently noble. It depends entirely on who's holding the door. Which brings us to you, right now, in your own century. You've lived through your own version of a chalk cross on the door, whether you fully register it or not. Lockdowns. Case counts published daily like a modern Bill of Mortality. Neighborhoods that went quiet. Some people simply left for second homes, the same way Charles II left for Oxford, while others stayed sealed into small apartments with people who were sick because they had no other option. The uncomfortable truth Eyam still whispers across 400 years is this. The difference between isolation as punishment and isolation as protection was never really about the isolation itself. It was about trust, whether the person shutting the door believed they were protecting you or simply hiding you from view. Ask yourself, honestly, which one it usually felt like. And maybe that's the quiet thing worth carrying out of all this. Every era invents its own version of the sealed door. The technology changes. The chalk changes to case numbers. The watchman changes to an app. But the core decision, whether to isolate out of fear or isolate out of care, whether to run like a king or stay like a village, that decision keeps arriving, generation after generation, dressed differently each time. There is a chalk cross painted on a door in London, and it has been there for 400 years now. It just doesn't look like chalk anymore.